My husband laughed at me during my assault testimony. The male detective humiliated him for it, then I put the nail in his coffin. I was at the police station giving my statement about being assaulted by my boss when my husband started chuckling at something on his phone. Detective Dudasic, who looked like he ate concrete for breakfast, stopped mid-sentence and stared at my husband like he already wanted to say something. Can you describe what happened next? Dudasic continued gently. He cornered me in the supply room. My voice cracked. Here we go, Francis muttered under his breath, not even looking up from his phone. Dudasic's jaw now tightened. Sir, your wife is describing her sexual assault. I'd advise you to show some respect. Francis looked up. I am showing respect. She's just a bit dramatic though, isn't she? It's just some guy getting handsy. Francis shifted in his chair. How long is this going to take? My game starts at 8. I continued through tears. He pushed me against the wall, tore my blouse. Francis actually laughed at something on his screen. Out loud. He said my husband told him I was uptight, I whispered. That I just needed loosening up. That finally made Francis look up, but only to roll his eyes. Should have just reported to HR instead of making a federal case out of it. Detective Dudasic stood up slowly. Sir, I don't want to lose my job, so I'm going to need you to step outside. Why? I'm supporting her. She wants me here, don't you? He turned to me. I felt trapped by that question. But before I could answer it, Dudasic jumped in. Listen here. Laughing while your wife describes her trauma is special ed behavior. His voice was controlled but furious. I've worked here for 9 years. I've been a prison guard for 5. I've never seen someone not care about their spouse's trauma. I've dealt with bottom-of-the-barrel scum, and they seem like better men than you. Francis's face went beet red. Excuse me? Real men protect their partners. And I'm no doctor, but I suggest you get a physical. Maybe a specialist will tell you why you come off as a flip-flop more than a man. Francis was furious now. Oh, so you're trying to white knight my wife now? Francis stood up, chest puffed out. Trying to mock me in front of her play hero? Dudasic stayed calm. I'm trying to take a statement about a serious crime while you're treating it like a comedy show. Now sit down. And show this woman some respect. Because if you keep acting like a jackass, she'll find someone who will. I could tell that stung Francis. So much so that suddenly Francis was the perfect husband. Grabbing my hand too tight, declaring he'd kill the guy, demanding to know every detail after ignoring me for 6 weeks since it happened. He started taking photos of my bruises even though the forensics team had already documented everything. What's the assailant's name? Detective Dudasic asked. Richard Adamus, I said clearly. Francis's face drained of color. Richard? You must be confused. Richard Adamus, I repeated, turning to Francis. Your best friend from Cornell? Your groomsman? The one you golf with every Sunday? Richie would never... The one you got me the job with as a favor. My voice was getting stronger, while Francis's mouth opened and closed like it was on a loop. That's when I turned to Francis and dropped the bomb. While your friend was assaulting me, he whispered in my ear that you complained about our intimacy life to him. That you told him I needed someone to break me in. Detective Dudasic had been typing on his computer. Sir, I'm pulling up some text messages here that were already submitted anonymously as evidence. Would you like to explain this exchange? He turned his screen toward us. My stomach dropped reading Francis's text to Richard from 2 days before the assault. Richard, your wife's hot, bet she's wild when drunk. Francis, haha, she's too uptight, needs someone to break her in. Richard, maybe I'll help with that. Francis, good luck bro, she's all work no. Play. These are from Tuesday, Dudasic said. The assault happened Thursday. I stared at Francis. You knew. You knew when I came home crying. When I showed you my torn clothes. When I begged you to come with me to the police. I thought you were exaggerating. Rich is a good guy, he wouldn't... I had bruises. Torn clothing, I was bleeding. Rich gets carried away sometimes when he drinks, but... You're still defending him? I pulled out Francis's phone from his pocket. His recent calls showed 3 to Richard just this morning. You called him 3 times today. After you knew we were coming here. Francis grabbed for his phone. That's not... I was just... warning him? Detective Dudasic asked. That's witness tampering. That's a felony. Francis's face went white. I want a lawyer. You're going to need one, Dudasic said. Sit tight. We'll be charging you as an accessory. And sir? We picked Richard up an hour ago. He really wants to talk to you. We usually don't allow this, but we can make an exception. My husband's face went white. And when we walked out, we locked eyes with Richard being brought in. He smiled at Francis, then glanced at me as if he had something planned. A woman with short gray hair and kind eyes appeared beside me while I was still staring at Richard's retreating back. She touched my arm gently and introduced herself as Allegra, a victim advocate with the police department. Her voice was calm and steady, cutting through the fog in my brain that made everything feel distant and unreal. She guided me to a small office down the hall, while Detective Dudasic stayed behind to process Francis and coordinate with the officers handling Richard. The office had soft lighting and a box of tissues on the desk, which somehow made me want to cry more than anything else that had happened today. Allegra sat across from me and pulled out a folder filled with colorful pamphlets about protective orders, counseling services, and emergency housing options. She spread them across the desk and started explaining what would happen next in words I could actually understand, not legal talk that went over my head. She told me about my rights as a victim, about the criminal process, about resources available to help me stay safe. I tried to focus on her words but kept seeing Richard's smile in my mind, that look he gave me like he knew something I didn't. Allegra noticed my hands shaking and pushed a bottle of water across the desk. She asked if I was okay to continue, or if I needed a break, and I told her I wanted to keep going, because stopping meant thinking, and I couldn't think right now. She nodded and shifted to practical questions about my immediate safety. Where would I stay tonight, she asked. Did I have family nearby who could help? Who did I trust to call if I felt unsafe or needed support? I opened my mouth to answer and realized I didn't have good answers to any of those questions. Francis had slowly pushed most of my friends away over the years, always finding reasons why we shouldn't go to their parties, or why they were bad influences, or why we needed couple time instead. My college roommate moved to Seattle 2 years ago, and we only texted on birthdays now. My mom and sister lived 3 states away in Ohio, and I hadn't told them anything about the assault because I didn't want to worry them or admit my marriage was falling apart. Allegra watched my face as I worked through this realization, and didn't push me to answer faster. She just waited while I understood how isolated I'd become without even noticing it happening. Finally, I admitted I didn't really have anyone local and my family was far away. Allegra wrote something in her notes and told me that was okay, that we'd figure out a plan together. Detective Dudasik knocked and entered the office carrying a clear plastic evidence bag. Inside was my torn blouse from that day in the supply room, the one I'd brought to the station in a paper bag because I knew they'd need it. He also had printed photos of my bruises that the forensic technician had taken earlier, and he spread them on the desk next to the pamphlets. He explained they were keeping Richard in custody overnight for processing, and would present everything to the assistant district attorney first thing tomorrow morning. He reviewed what they'd collected so far in a methodical way that made it feel real and official. The supply room access logs showed Richard had badged into that area during my shift when he had no work reason to be there. Security footage showed me entering the supply room and Richard following 90 seconds later, then both of us leaving 14 minutes after that with me visibly distressed. Millie from accounting had given a statement about seeing me right after with my clothes messed up and tears on my face. The text messages between Francis and Richard were already submitted as evidence. My medical exam from the hospital showed bruising consistent with being held down. Detective Dudasik's voice was gentle but factual as he listed each piece, and I felt grateful he was treating this like the serious crime it was. When he finished, Allegra asked if I had questions about the evidence or the process. I shook my head because I just wanted this part to be over. Detective Dudasik said he'd be back in a few minutes and left to finish paperwork. I heard voices in the hallway and recognized Francis's tone, that specific pitch he used when he was trying to sound reasonable while actually being demanding. The door opened and Francis tried to walk into the office where Allegra and I sat, but Detective Dudasik stepped between us and blocked the doorway with his body. He told Francis firmly to wait in the lobby, that he couldn't be in here right now. Francis protested that he was my husband and had a right to be with me, but Detective Dudasik didn't budge. He told Francis he was recommending charges for witness tampering based on those 3 phone calls to Richard this morning. He said depending on what else they found during the investigation, Francis might also face charges as an accessory to the assault. Francis's face went white and he started to argue, but Detective Dudasik just pointed down the hallway and told him to go sit down and wait for his lawyer. I watched through the doorway as Francis walked away, his shoulders tight with anger, and I felt nothing. No sympathy, no urge to defend him, nothing but a hollow space where my marriage used to be. Allegra closed the door and asked if I was all right. I nodded even though I wasn't, and she started talking about protective orders and how we could file for one tomorrow. My phone buzzed and I jumped, my heart racing. Allegra asked if I wanted to check it, and I pulled out my phone with shaking hands. It was a call from a number I didn't recognize with a local area code. Allegra suggested I answer and put it on speaker in case it was important. I hit the button, and a man's voice introduced himself as Gabriel Siegel, the assistant district attorney who'd been assigned my case. His tone was professional but warm, not cold or dismissive like I'd feared. He said Detective Dudasik had briefed him on the evidence, and he was confident about moving forward with charges against Richard for assault, and possibly additional counts. He'd also be reviewing Francis's involvement separately to determine appropriate charges there. I thanked him quietly, not sure what else to say. Gabriel continued that he wanted me to know he took these cases seriously, and would do everything possible to get justice. Then his voice shifted slightly, and he warned me that Richard's lawyer would likely push for a quick bail hearing. I should expect Richard to be released with restrictions rather than held until trial, he said. My stomach dropped and I looked at Allegra, who reached across the desk and squeezed my hand. Gabriel asked if I had somewhere safe to stay tonight because going home wasn't advisable if Francis had keys and knew my routine. I admitted I was planning to go back to our apartment to pack a bag, but now I was scared Francis would be there, or would follow me. My voice cracked saying it out loud. Allegra immediately jumped in and said she'd arrange a police escort to help me get my things safely. She was already pulling out her phone to make calls while Gabriel stayed on the line. He told me this was the right decision, that my safety had to come first. He said he'd be in touch tomorrow with updates and to call his office anytime if I had questions or concerns. After we hung up, Allegra finished her call and told me Detective Dudasik had agreed to meet me at my apartment in 2 hours with another officer. She emphasized I should bring only what I could carry in one trip, because we wouldn't have time for multiple loads. Detective Dudasik wanted me in and out quickly for safety reasons. I started making a mental list of what I absolutely needed while Allegra pulled out a hotel voucher from her desk drawer. She explained it was good for 3 nights at a chain hotel near the police station, paid for by emergency funding from a victim services grant. She wrote her cell phone number on the back of the voucher in clear print and told me to call anytime, day or night, if I felt unsafe or needed to talk through next steps. I took the voucher and stared at it. This small piece of paper that represented having nowhere to go. Allegra stood and gave me a quick hug, the kind that felt motherly and safe. She said we'd get through this together, one step at a time. I nodded and tried to believe her. I left Allegra's office with the hotel voucher clutched in my hand and drove to my apartment complex with Detective Dudasik following in his patrol car. Another officer was already waiting in the parking lot when we arrived. Detective stood by my door while I moved through the rooms grabbing things I needed. I pulled clothes from my closet without really looking at them, stuffed toiletries from the bathroom into a bag, unplugged my laptop from the desk. My hands shook the whole time. I kept glancing at the door expecting Francis to burst through even though Detective was right there watching. In the bedroom, I grabbed my important documents from the filing cabinet, my birth certificate and passport and bank statements. Then I went to Francis's desk to look for anything else I might need. That's when I saw them. Printed text messages, pages and pages of them sitting in a folder. I picked up the first page and started reading. My stomach turned. Richard and Francis had been texting about women at my office for months. Crude jokes about their bodies, comments about what they'd like to do to them. And then I found messages about me. Richard saying I looked good in a skirt I wore to the office picnic. Francis responding that I had nice legs but was too stuck up. Richard asking if I was always so serious. Francis saying I needed someone to loosen me up. Maybe a few drinks would help. I felt like I was going to throw up. There were more. Richard commenting on my body after I wore a dress to the company party. Francis agreeing and adding details about our bedroom that made me want to scream. This wasn't just dismissive. This wasn't just not believing me. Francis had been participating in this for months. He'd been encouraging Richard, setting me up. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and started taking pictures of every page. Detective noticed what I was doing and came over. He looked at the pages and his jaw got tight. He pulled evidence bags from his pocket and carefully placed each page inside while I finished photographing them. The evidence felt like it was burning my hands. I grabbed my bags and we left. I couldn't stay in that apartment another second knowing what Francis had been doing behind my back. The hotel room was small and generic with beige walls and a floral bedspread that had probably been there since the 90s. I dropped my bags by the door and sat on the bed. Then I started crying. Not the quiet tears from the police station, but full-body sobs that made my chest hurt. I wasn't just crying about the assault anymore. I was crying about my marriage. About the man I thought I knew. About 5 years of my life spent with someone who talked about me like that to his friends. Who made jokes about my body. Who told his friend I needed to be broken in. My phone buzzed. A text from Allegra asking if I made it to the hotel okay. I wiped my face and typed back that I was fine even though I absolutely wasn't. I stared at the message after I sent it. Fine. Such a useless word. I wasn't fine. I didn't know if I'd ever be fine again. But what else was I supposed to say? That I was falling apart? That I felt like my entire life had been a lie? I plugged my phone into charge and lay back on the bed staring at the ceiling. The room smelled like cleaning products and old carpet. I could hear people talking in the hallway. A door slamming somewhere. Normal hotel sounds. But nothing felt normal. Nothing would ever feel normal again. My phone started buzzing again an hour later. Text messages from Francis. The first one said he was sorry and he loved me and he wanted to explain everything. I stared at it. Then another one came through. This one said I was overreacting and making everything worse by involving the police. Then another. This one said I was ruining his life and his career over nothing. I watched them come in one after another. Apologetic, then defensive, then angry. A whole cycle playing out in text form. My hands were shaking again, but this time from anger instead of fear. I remembered what Allegra had taught me. Screenshot everything. Document everything. I took screenshots of each message exactly like she showed me. Then I forwarded them all to Detective Dudasik's email address. He responded within minutes telling me I did the right thing and to block Francis's number immediately. I went into my phone settings and blocked him. Just like that. After 5 years of marriage, I blocked my husband's number. The small act of control felt good. Like I was taking back something he'd stolen from me. I checked the door lock again even though I'd already checked it twice. Then I sat back down on the bed and tried to figure out what to do next. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear a sound in the hallway and jerk awake. Someone walking past my door. The elevator dinging. A car alarm in the parking lot. Each sound sent my heart racing. I got up and checked the door lock probably 10 times. I looked through the peephole at the empty hallway. I moved the desk chair in front of the door even though it had a deadbolt. Nothing felt safe enough. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up on sleeping entirely. I opened my laptop and pulled up a blank document. Detective had told me to write down everything I remembered about the assault in order. Every detail I could think of. The time, the location, what Richard said, what he did, how I responded, what happened after. My hands hovered over the keyboard for a long time before I started typing. Writing it all down felt like living through it again. But I forced myself to keep going. Richard cornering me in the supply room. The smell of his cologne, his hand on my arm, me trying to back away, him pushing me against the wall, the sound of my blouse tearing, his breath on my neck, the things he whispered about Francis, about me being uptight, about breaking me in. I typed for over an hour. By the time I finished, the sun was starting to come up outside my window. I saved the document and closed my laptop. My whole body ached like I'd run a marathon. But at least I had it all written down now. All the details before they started fading or getting confused in my memory. Morning came and I checked my email on my phone still lying in bed. There was one from HR. The subject line said, "Important meeting request." I opened it with a sinking feeling in my stomach. The email asked me to attend an informational meeting about my leave options and workplace accommodations. It was written in formal corporate language that sounded supportive on the surface but felt cold underneath. They wanted to discuss my situation and help me understand my options going forward. The whole tone felt wrong. Like they were more worried about protecting the company than protecting me. Like they wanted to make sure I wasn't going to sue them or cause problems. I read it 3 times trying to figure out if I was being paranoid. But every time I read it, the formal language felt more threatening. More like they were building a case against me instead of trying to help. I forwarded the email to Allegra without responding to HR. I didn't trust myself to write back without saying something I'd regret. And I definitely didn't trust HR to have my best interests in mind. My phone rang around 10 in the morning. Detective Dudasic. I answered immediately. He told me they'd formally charged Francis with witness tampering based on the phone records. 3 calls to Richard the morning we went to the police station. Clear evidence that Francis had been warning him, trying to get their stories straight. The arraignment was scheduled for that afternoon. Detective said I didn't need to attend if I didn't want to, but I could go if I wanted to see how the process worked. I told him I didn't think I could handle being in the same room as Francis again. Not after everything I'd learned. Not after those text messages. Detective said he understood and that was completely fine. He'd keep me updated on what happened. Then he asked how I was holding up at the hotel. I lied and said I was okay. He probably knew I was lying, but he didn't push. He just reminded me to call him anytime if I needed anything, or if Francis tried to contact me again. After we hung up, I sat on the bed staring at my phone. Francis was arraigned this afternoon. My husband was going to court for helping my assaulter. The words didn't feel real even though I was living through them. Another email came through an hour later. This one from Gabriel Siegel. The subject line said Richard Adamus case timeline. I opened it and started reading. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks from now. Richard's arraignment had already happened yesterday afternoon, and he'd pleaded not guilty like Gabriel expected. The email explained my rights as a victim in the criminal process. I had the right to be present at all proceedings, the right to submit a victim impact statement, the right to be notified of any plea agreements or changes in Richard's custody status. Gabriel had attached a document that laid everything out in detail. I read through it twice trying to absorb all the information. There was so much I didn't know about how any of this worked. So many steps and procedures and legal terms I'd never heard before. The document was helpful but also overwhelming. This was going to take months, maybe longer, and I'd have to be involved in every step watching Richard and Francis go through the system while I tried to put my life back together. I closed my laptop and put my head in my hands. The next email from Gabriel came that afternoon. Richard had made bail again with stricter conditions this time. GPS monitoring, no contact orders, surrendering his passport. But he was out, walking around free while I was hiding in a hotel room. Gabriel warned me that Richard's lawyer was already positioning the case as a misunderstanding between colleagues, saying it was a consensual encounter that I regretted later, saying I was confused about what happened. I felt sick reading those words. The defense was going to try to make it sound like I wanted it, like I led Richard on, like the torn clothes and bruises and my crying were all just a misunderstanding. They were going to minimize what happened in that supply room, turn it into something less than what it was, make me look like a liar or someone who couldn't tell the difference between assault and a bad hookup. My hands were shaking again. I forwarded the email to Allegra and asked her what I should do. She called me 5 minutes later and told me to meet her at the courthouse in an hour. We were going to file for protective orders against both Richard and Francis. Emergency orders that would be in effect immediately. I grabbed my purse and headed out. The courthouse was busy and confusing with people everywhere and signs pointing in different directions. Allegra met me at the entrance and guided me through security and up to the right floor. We sat in hard plastic chairs filling out forms for almost 2 hours. Temporary protective orders against Richard Adamus and Francis Calloway. I had to write down why I needed protection, what they'd done, why I was afraid. My hand cramped from writing, but I kept going. Finally, a clerk called us into a small courtroom. A judge reviewed my paperwork while Allegra and I stood there waiting. The judge asked me a few questions about the assault and about Francis showing up at places I was staying. I answered as clearly as I could, even though my voice kept shaking. Then the judge signed the orders. Emergency protective orders valid for 2 weeks until we could have full hearings to make them permanent. The clerk handed me official papers with the court seal. Richard and Francis couldn't contact me or come within 500 feet of me. If they violated the orders, they'd be arrested immediately. I held the papers in my hands, feeling like they should mean more than they did. They were just pieces of paper, but they were also legal protection. Official recognition that I needed to be kept safe from my own husband and my former boss. Allegra walked me back to my car and told me to keep those papers with me at all times. To call 911 immediately if either of them violated the orders. I drove back to the hotel clutching the steering wheel too tight and trying not to think about how insufficient those papers felt against everything that had happened. That evening, I was lying on the hotel bed staring at the ceiling when someone knocked on my door. I froze. The knock came again, harder this time. I crept to the peephole and my stomach turned over. Francis stood in the hallway looking around like he was checking if anyone saw him. I backed away from the door as quietly as I could. He knocked again and called my name through the door. I grabbed my phone and ran into the bathroom, locking that door too, even though it felt stupid. My hands shook so bad I could barely dial 911. The operator answered, and I whispered that my husband was at my hotel room and he had a protective order against him. She told me to stay on the line and said officers were being sent. Francis kept knocking and calling my name, his voice getting louder. Then I heard him try the door handle. The operator asked if I was safe, and I said I was locked in the bathroom, but he was trying to get in the room. She said hotel security was notified too. Francis started banging on the door now, demanding I open it so we could talk. His voice had that edge to it that used to make me do whatever he wanted just to keep the peace. But I stayed quiet in the bathroom with the phone pressed to my ear. The operator kept talking to me in a calm voice, asking if I could still hear him, asking if he'd gotten inside. Then I heard different voices in the hallway. Security. They were telling Francis he needed to come with them. Francis argued that I was his wife and he just wanted to talk. They said the police were on the way and he needed to leave now. More arguing. Then it got quieter, like they were moving away from my door. The operator told me to stay where I was until police arrived. I sat on the bathroom floor holding the phone and shaking. Maybe 10 minutes later, someone knocked and announced it was hotel security with police officers. I made them show me their badges through the peephole before I opened the door. 2 officers stood there with a security guard. They asked if I was okay and I nodded even though I wasn't. One officer explained they had Francis detained downstairs and he would be arrested for violating the protective order. They asked if I wanted to come down to give a statement or if they could take it here. I said here because I didn't want to see Francis again. They came inside and I sat on the edge of the bed answering their questions. When did he arrive? What did he say? Did he try to force entry? Was I injured? I showed them the protective order papers from the courthouse. They took photos of the papers and wrote everything down. Then they said Francis was being taken to the station, and I could follow up tomorrow if I wanted to press additional charges. After they left, I went to the window and looked down at the parking lot. I could see the police cars with their lights on. Officers were putting Francis in the back of one car, his hands behind his back in handcuffs. I watched until the cars drove away. Then I sat back down on the bed and started crying because even with a court order and police involvement, Francis had still found me and shown up. About 20 minutes later, Detective Dudasic called my phone. He said he heard what happened and asked if I was okay. I said I was fine, but my voice came out shaky. He asked if I wanted company or if I'd rather be alone. I surprised myself by saying company would be good. He said he'd be there in 15 minutes. When he arrived, we sat in the hotel lobby because I didn't want to be alone in my room, and the lobby felt safer with other people around. Detective sat in the chair across from me, and his solid presence made me feel a little less scared. He explained that violating a protective order was its own criminal charge, separate from the witness tampering. Francis would be arraigned on this new charge probably tomorrow. He said this violation made Francis look dangerous, and would help the case that he needed stricter bail conditions, or maybe no bail at all until trial. I asked if Francis could just keep getting released and keep showing up. Detective said each violation made that less likely, and now that Francis had shown he would ignore court orders, the judge would take it more seriously. He asked how Francis found me at this hotel. I realized Francis probably still had access to our credit card accounts and could see the hotel charge. Detective made a note about that and said I needed to freeze those accounts tomorrow. We sat there for maybe half an hour while I stopped shaking. He didn't rush me or try to make small talk. Just sat there like a wall between me and everything scary outside. When I finally felt steady enough, he walked me back to my room and waited while I checked inside to make sure no one was there. Before he left, he gave me his personal cell number and told me to call anytime, day or night, if I felt unsafe. After he was gone, I realized I needed to tell someone what was happening. My family. I'd been avoiding calling them because I didn't know how to explain everything. But sitting alone in that hotel room after Francis showed up, I couldn't do it by myself anymore. I pulled up my sister's number and hit call before I could change my mind. She answered on the second ring, sounding happy to hear from me. Then I started talking and everything came out in a rush. The assault at work, Francis's text with Richard, the police station, the charges, the protective order, Francis showing up tonight. I was crying so hard I could barely get the words out. My sister kept saying, "Oh my God," and asking if I was safe right now. I said yes, the police took Francis away, but I was scared and alone and didn't know what to do. She didn't hesitate. She said she was booking a flight right now and would be there tomorrow morning. I tried to say she didn't need to do that. She had work and her own life. She cut me off and said work could wait and I needed her, so she was coming. Period. I heard her typing on her computer while we talked, looking up flights. She found one that left at 6 in the morning her time and would get her to me by noon. I started crying harder, but this time it was relief. She told me to try to sleep and she'd text me when she landed. After we hung up, I felt like I could breathe a little easier. My sister was coming. I wouldn't be alone anymore. That night, I actually slept a few hours, which was more than I'd managed since this whole thing started. The next morning, Allegra called while I was drinking terrible hotel coffee. She'd heard about Francis violating the order and wanted to check on me. I told her about my sister coming and she said that was really good. I needed support right now. Then she said she'd arranged for the hotel to extend my stay another week while we figured out something more permanent. The Victim Services Fund would cover it. I felt a weight lift because I'd been worried about money. Allegra also said she was connecting me with a legal aid clinic that could help with the protective order hearings and eventually divorce stuff. She gave me a name and number to call. I wrote it down, but looking at all the systems I had to deal with made my head hurt. Criminal case against Richard. Criminal case against Francis. Protective orders. Workplace issues. Housing. Money. Divorce. It was too much to keep track of. Allegra must have heard something in my voice because she said to take it one thing at a time and she'd help me prioritize. First thing was the protective order hearing to make the emergency orders permanent. That was scheduled for next week. Everything else could wait a few days. I thanked her and said I didn't know what I'd do without her help. She said that's what she was there for, and to call if I needed anything. That afternoon, I had the video call with HR. I'd been dreading it all morning. I set up my laptop on the hotel desk and logged into the meeting at exactly 2 o'clock. Connor Walsh from HR appeared on screen with his fake concerned expression. He started by saying how sorry he was about what happened, and the company took these matters very seriously. Then he launched into explaining my leave options. Short-term disability, FMLA, unpaid leave. He went through each one in detail, talking about how long they lasted and what paperwork I'd need. But the whole time he kept adding little comments about how difficult it would be to hold my position long-term. How the team was already stretched thin covering my work. How maybe I should think about whether this was the right environment for me anymore. He actually suggested I might want to explore other opportunities for a fresh start somewhere that didn't have these difficult memories. I sat there feeling sick as I realized what he was doing. He was trying to get me to quit. The company didn't want to deal with the liability of Richard assaulting me on their property during work hours. Easier if I just left on my own. Connor kept talking about how stressful it must be to think about coming back, how maybe it wasn't worth putting myself through that. He made it sound like he was being nice and looking out for me. But really, he was pushing me toward the door. The meeting lasted 30 minutes, and by the end, I felt angry instead of scared. This was wrong. They were trying to push out the victim instead of taking responsibility. As soon as the call ended, I grabbed my phone and opened the recording app. I'd started recording right when the meeting began, keeping my phone next to my laptop the whole time. I didn't tell them I was recording. I saved the file and immediately sent it to Allegra with a message saying HR was trying to make me quit. She called me back within 5 minutes. She listened to my description of the call and said this was retaliation, and the company could get in serious trouble for it. She said she knew an employment lawyer who handled these cases, and would I be okay with her sharing the recording? I said yes, absolutely. An hour later, the employment lawyer called me. Her name was something professional sounding, but I was too stressed to remember it clearly. She listened to the whole recording while we were on the phone. When it finished, she said Connor had been very careful with his words, but the pattern was clear. They were creating a hostile environment to force me out. She said this was illegal and we had options. We could file a complaint with the state labor board. We could send them a letter putting them on notice. We could potentially sue if they actually terminated me or forced me to resign. She asked what I wanted to do. I said I just wanted them to leave me alone and let me keep my job without pressure. She said she'd draft a letter to HR documenting their inappropriate behavior and making clear that any retaliation would have legal consequences. That made me feel a little better. At least someone was pushing back on them. The next morning, my sister's plane landed right on time. I met her at baggage claim and we hugged for a long time while I cried into her shoulder. She looked tired from the early flight, but she smiled and said she was here now and everything would be okay. We drove back to the hotel and she dropped her suitcase in my room. Then she immediately started taking charge of things I'd been too overwhelmed to handle. She called the post office to forward my mail to the hotel. She got on the phone with my credit card companies and froze the joint accounts with Francis. She made a list of bills that needed paying and helped me set up automatic payments from my personal checking account. She ordered real food for lunch instead of letting me eat vending machine snacks. Having her there made everything feel less impossible. She was practical and organized and didn't let me spiral into panic. That afternoon, we sat on the hotel beds, and she asked me to explain everything again now that I was calmer. I walked her through the whole timeline. The assault 6 weeks ago. Telling Francis and him dismissing it. Finally going to the police. Finding out about the text messages. Francis getting charged. Richard getting arrested. The protective orders. Francis showing up here. All of it. My sister listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said Francis was garbage and she was glad he was facing charges. She also said I was incredibly brave for reporting everything and following through. I didn't feel brave, but hearing her say it helped. A few days later, Gabriel called and asked me to come to his office for a meeting. He wanted to prepare me for the preliminary hearing that was coming up. My sister drove me downtown to the DA's office and came in with me. Gabriel's office was small and cluttered with case files, but he seemed organized. He explained what would happen at the preliminary hearing. I'd have to testify about the assault. Richard's lawyer would be there and might ask me questions, but Gabriel would object to anything inappropriate. The judge just needed to determine if there was enough evidence to move forward, which Gabriel said was a pretty low bar. But he wanted me prepared for how it would feel to testify with Richard in the room. He was honest that Richard's lawyer would try to make me uncomfortable. They might question details of my story or suggest I was confused about what happened. Gabriel said he'd object to anything that crossed the line, but I should expect them to be aggressive. He asked if I had any questions. I asked if I had to testify or if there was enough evidence without me. Gabriel said technically they could proceed without my testimony, but it would be much stronger if I testified. The jury would want to hear from me directly. I said okay, I'd do it. Gabriel walked me through what questions he'd ask and how to answer clearly and directly. We practiced for about an hour. By the end, I felt slightly more prepared, but still scared. That same week, detective called with good news. He said they'd interviewed Millie Newton from my office. Millie was the coworker who saw me right after the assault when I came out of the supply room. She'd given a statement describing how I looked. Torn blouse. Tears running down my face. Shaking. Millie told them I was clearly in distress and she asked if I was okay. I'd said I needed to go home and then I'd left work early. Detective said Millie's statement was important because it showed my immediate reaction. It backed up my timeline and proved I was visibly upset right after the assault happened. Gabriel had told him this kind of evidence was crucial. It showed this wasn't something I made up later or a consensual encounter I regretted. There was a witness to my distress in the immediate aftermath. I felt grateful to Millie for coming forward. A lot of people saw me that day, but she was the one who actually talked to the police. Detective also mentioned they were still building the case and looking into whether there were other complaints about Richard at the company. I said I didn't know of any, but I wasn't surprised if there were. Richard had always been inappropriate with comments and looks. I just never thought he'd actually assault someone. The following weekend, Allegra arranged for my sister and me to look at apartments. She'd pulled listings in my price range if I was living alone on just my income. We met her at the first place, a studio apartment in an older building. It was small and the carpet was worn, but it was clean and the landlord seemed nice. The rent was $800 a month, which was about the most I could afford. We looked at 2 more places that afternoon. One was too expensive, and one was in a sketchy neighborhood my sister immediately vetoed. We went back to the first studio and I filled out an application. Sitting in Allegra's car afterward, the reality of my financial situation hit hard. Francis had controlled most of our money during our marriage. I had my own checking account, but he managed the savings and investments. I'd been too scared to touch the joint account since he started getting charged with crimes. Now looking at what I could afford on my salary alone, I realized how much I'd depended on him financially. The studio was tiny compared to our house. I'd have to get rid of most of my furniture because it wouldn't fit. I'd be living paycheck to paycheck with no savings cushion. My sister squeezed my hand and reminded me this was temporary. Once the divorce went through, I'd get my share of everything. But right now, I needed to focus on being safe and stable. The money stuff could be worked out later. I knew she was right, but it was still scary seeing how little I could afford on my own. The next morning, I sat in a small office at the legal aid clinic, with my sister beside me, and a lawyer named Miss Miranda across a scratched wooden desk. Miss Miranda had short gray hair and reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and she spoke in a calm, matter-of-fact way that made everything feel slightly less overwhelming. She explained I could file for emergency spousal support and temporary use of joint funds, while the criminal cases were pending against Francis. The process required going to family court and submitting financial affidavits showing our income and expenses. Miss Miranda warned me that Francis would be at the hearing because he had a right to contest the amounts, and I felt my stomach drop at the thought of seeing him again. My sister reached over and squeezed my hand hard under the table. Miss Miranda slid the paperwork across to me and pointed to where I needed to sign, and my hand shook as I picked up the pen. I kept thinking about sitting in a courtroom with Francis staring at me while a judge decided how much money I could access from our own accounts. But I also thought about that tiny studio apartment, and how I couldn't even afford basic furniture on my salary alone. I signed the forms, and Miss Miranda said she'd file them today, and we'd have a court date within 2 weeks. Back at the hotel that afternoon, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Francis's mother, Wilhelmina, started talking immediately in her clipped, precise voice that always made me feel like I was scolded. She said I was destroying her son's life over a misunderstanding, that Francis made a mistake but he didn't deserve to lose everything, that I needed to think about our marriage vows and forgiveness. I listened for maybe 30 seconds while she went on about how Richard was Francis's oldest friend, and Francis was just trying to be loyal, how I was being vindictive and cruel by pressing charges. Then I hung up without saying a word. I went into my phone settings and blocked her number immediately, my hands moving fast before I could second-guess myself. After I finished, I sat on the edge of the hotel bed and started crying. Not because of what she said, but because I used to have such a good relationship with Wilhelmina. We'd have lunch together once a month and she'd tell me stories about Francis as a kid. Now that relationship was just gone. Another thing this whole situation had taken from me. 2 days later, Gabriel called while I was eating cereal in the hotel room. He said Richard's lawyer had requested a meeting to discuss a potential plea agreement, which surprised everyone because we were still so early in the process. Gabriel thought Richard's lawyer was worried about the text messages between Richard and Francis, and also about Millie's statement describing how I looked right after the assault. He said defense lawyers usually don't push for plea talks this soon, unless they're concerned about what might come out at trial. Gabriel asked if I was open to hearing what they might offer, and I said yes because I honestly didn't know what I wanted yet. He scheduled a meeting for the next afternoon at his office so we could discuss options before any formal plea negotiations happened. I met Gabriel and Allegra at the district attorney's office in a small conference room with a window overlooking the parking lot. Gabriel sat across from me with a yellow legal pad covered in notes, and Allegra sat beside me with her hand resting near mine on the table. Gabriel explained that a trial would mean testifying in detail about the assault in open court with Richard sitting right there, and his lawyer cross-examining me about every part of my story. He said the defense would try to make me look confused or vindictive, would bring up my marriage problems with Francis, would suggest I wanted this to happen, or that I made it up later. A plea deal might mean Richard got less punishment than a trial conviction, but it also meant I wouldn't have to go through that trauma of testifying and being attacked on the witness stand. I sat there feeling completely stuck, because part of me wanted Richard to face the maximum consequences. But another part of me felt sick thinking about describing the assault to a room full of strangers, while his lawyer tried to make me seem like a liar. Gabriel said I didn't need to decide anything yet, that this was just about understanding my options before we heard what Richard's lawyer might propose. My first therapy appointment happened 3 days later in a small office that smelled like lavender. Adriana had kind eyes and spoke softly, and she didn't push me when I struggled to find words to describe what happened. I kept starting sentences and then stopping, feeling like anything I said would sound stupid or dramatic. Adriana waited patiently through my stumbling attempts, and then shifted to talking about practical coping strategies for my anxiety and insomnia, instead of making me process everything right away. She taught me a breathing technique for when I felt panic rising, and suggested keeping a journal by my bed for when nightmares woke me up. It felt more manageable than I expected. Like maybe I could actually do this therapy thing without falling apart every session. The preliminary hearing arrived faster than I was ready for. My sister drove me to the courthouse and we sat in the hallway outside the courtroom until a bailiff called my name. Inside, the judge sat behind a tall wooden bench, and Richard sat at a table 20 feet away with his lawyer, a thin man in an expensive suit who kept writing notes on a legal pad. I walked to the witness stand with my legs shaking and put my hand on a Bible while the clerk asked if I swore to tell the truth. Gabriel stood near the judge's bench and asked me questions in a gentle voice, walking me through what happened that day in the supply room. I described Richard cornering me, pushing me against the shelves, tearing my blouse when I tried to leave. My voice cracked a few times, but I made it through the whole testimony without completely breaking down. Richard's lawyer asked me some questions about whether I'd been drinking that day, and whether Richard and I had ever flirted before, and I said no to both while staring at the wall behind the judge instead of looking at Richard. The judge said she found probable cause to move forward with the charges, and scheduled the next hearing for 6 weeks out. When I stood up from the witness chair, my legs were shaking, so hard that my sister had to hold my arm to help me walk out to the car. After the hearing ended, Richard's lawyer approached Gabriel in the courthouse hallway, while I waited with Allegra near the elevators. I watched them talk for a few minutes, the lawyer gesturing with his hands while Gabriel stood with his arms crossed. Later, Gabriel called to tell me Richard's lawyer had proposed a plea to reduce charges with probation and counseling but no jail time. Gabriel said he told the lawyer absolutely not, that the evidence was too strong and the crime too serious for such a light sentence. I felt grateful that Gabriel wasn't pressuring me to accept something inadequate just to close the case quickly. A week later, Gabriel called with an update about Francis's case. The prosecutor handling Francis's witness tampering charge had offered him a plea deal if he agreed to testify about his conversations with Richard before the assault. The deal would reduce the charge to a misdemeanor with probation, instead of the felony that could mean jail time. Gabriel asked if I was comfortable with Francis potentially helping the case against Richard, even though it meant Francis would face lighter consequences. I told Gabriel I needed time to think about it. I sat with my sister and Allegra that evening in my hotel room trying to work through how I felt about Francis cooperating. Part of me wanted him punished fully for what he did. For those phone calls warning Richard. For enabling the whole situation with his crude comments. But another part of me wanted the strongest possible case against Richard. Wanted to make sure Richard actually faced real consequences. My sister pointed out that Francis's testimony could establish that Richard planned the assault ahead of time, rather than it being a spontaneous mistake. Allegra reminded me that either way, Francis would still have a criminal record and probation. I eventually told Gabriel I would agree to Francis cooperating if it actually strengthened the case in meaningful ways, not just as a favor to Francis. Francis provided detailed statements to the prosecutors over the next week. Gabriel sent me the transcripts and I made myself read through them, even though it made me feel physically sick. Francis described conversations where Richard explicitly talked about wanting to make a move on me, where Francis encouraged it or joked about it, where they discussed my work schedule and when I'd be alone in the supply room. Reading their words laid out on paper, seeing how they'd planned this together, made me run to the bathroom and throw up. But Gabriel called afterward to say the statements established premeditation and showed Francis's knowing participation in creating the conditions for the assault, which would make the case against Richard much stronger. The employment lawyer reviewed everything I'd documented about HR's pressure and sent a formal letter within 2 days. The letter spelled out how Connor Walsh had suggested I quit instead of taking leave, how he'd implied my position couldn't be held, how he'd made the video call feel like an interrogation designed to push me out. The lawyer included legal citations about retaliation against assault victims and the company's potential liability if they continued this pattern. Connor's response email arrived the next morning and the tone shift was dramatic. He offered extended paid leave for as long as I needed, promised my position would be protected, and suggested we schedule a follow-up call to discuss any accommodations I might need when returning. I forwarded the email to Allegra and typed back a short acceptance of the leave offer without committing to any timeline for coming back. My sister and I spent the following week looking at apartments I could afford on just my income. Most places were too expensive or in neighborhoods that felt unsafe, but we finally found a studio in an older building with decent security and month-to-month lease terms. The apartment was tiny with a kitchenette barely big enough for one person and a bathroom that needed updating, but the landlord didn't require Francis's signature, and that made it perfect. My sister donated a futon from her spare room, some kitchen supplies, and helped me set up basic furniture from thrift stores. We spent an entire Saturday moving my stuff from the hotel and arranging everything so the space felt like mine. Standing in the middle of that small room with my sister, I felt safe for the first time in weeks, because Francis had never been here and didn't have keys. Francis started trying to contact me 2 days after I moved in. The first call came from a number I didn't recognize, and I answered thinking it might be Gabriel or detective. Francis's voice made me hang up immediately and block the number. Then came texts from different numbers, emails from new addresses he'd created, even a message through a mutual friend's social media account. Each attempt said some version of needing to talk, wanting to explain, claiming I was being unfair by cutting him off completely. I screenshot every message, documented the date and time, and forwarded everything to detective. Gabriel called after the fifth attempt to tell me they were building a strong pattern of protective order violations, and the prosecutor handling Francis's case was considering asking the judge to revoke his bail entirely. Gabriel called again a week later with news about Richard's case. Richard's lawyer had come back with a revised plea offer after reviewing the evidence and Francis's statements. The new offer was felony assault with 18 months in county jail, 3 years probation after release, mandatory counseling throughout, and registration as a sex offender. Gabriel walked me through what each piece meant in practical terms. The jail time was real consequences, not just probation. The registration meant Richard's information would be public, and he'd have restrictions on where he could live and work. Gabriel emphasized the decision was completely mine, that he'd support whatever I chose, and that going to trial was still an option if I wanted to pursue maximum punishment. I told Gabriel I needed time to think about it, and he said to take as long as I needed within reason, since the offer wouldn't stay on the table forever. That evening, I attended my first support group meeting for assault survivors that Adriana had recommended. The meeting was in a community center basement with folding chairs arranged in a circle, and about 8 other women at various stages of their own cases or recovery. Hearing their stories made me feel less alone, but also overwhelmed by how common this was. How many of us were navigating similar systems and facing similar responses from people who should have protected us. The group leader talked about how the criminal justice system has real limitations, how even good outcomes often feel insufficient, and how important it was to define our own healing separate from whatever legal resolution we got. I left feeling both supported and exhausted, like I'd absorbed everyone else's pain on top of my own. My sister had to fly home 3 days later for work she couldn't postpone any longer. We drove to the airport together and I tried not to cry until we got to the security checkpoint. She hugged me tight and made me promise to call her every single day, to keep going to therapy even when it felt hard, to reach out to Allegra anytime I needed support. I promised everything she asked while tears ran down my face, and I watched her go through security until I couldn't see her anymore. Driving back to my apartment alone felt scary in a way I hadn't expected, like I was losing my safety net and would have to handle everything by myself now. My next therapy session with Adriana focused on managing panic attacks and identifying my specific triggers. We worked through grounding techniques like naming 5 things I could see, 4 things I could touch, 3 things I could hear. Adriana helped me recognize that men standing too close triggered my fight or flight response, that closed doors made my heart race, that Francis's cologne scent could send me into a full panic even when he wasn't around. Having names for these triggers made them feel slightly less overwhelming, like I could prepare for them instead of being ambushed. Adriana gave me homework to practice the grounding techniques daily, so they'd become automatic when I actually needed them. Gabriel called the following week with an update about Francis's case. The prosecutor handling the witness tampering charge was willing to recommend a lenient sentence because Francis's cooperation had been so valuable to building the case against Richard. The recommendation would be probation instead of jail time, mandatory counseling, and a fine but no actual incarceration. Gabriel asked if I was comfortable with this arrangement, acknowledging that it meant Francis would face lighter consequences than I might want. I told Gabriel I hated it, but understood the strategic reason, that I wanted the strongest case possible against Richard, even if it meant Francis got off easier than he deserved. I spent the next few days talking through the plea offer decision with Allegra, with Adriana in therapy, and with my sister on the phone every night. The thought of testifying at trial and being cross-examined about every detail of the assault felt unbearable when I really let myself imagine it. Richard's lawyer would question my memory, suggest I'd misunderstood his intentions, imply I'd somehow invited or encouraged what happened. The plea offer meant Richard would face real jail time and registration without putting me through that additional trauma. After talking it through from every angle, I called Gabriel and told him I wanted to accept the plea offer. He said he'd notify Richard's lawyer and start preparing for the plea hearing. Gabriel called back 2 days later to confirm the plea hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out. He explained I could give a victim impact statement if I wanted to, that this would be my chance to tell the judge directly how the assault had affected my life. I told Gabriel I wanted to do it, and he sent me information about what to include and how long it should be. I started writing that same evening, sitting at my small kitchen table with my laptop, trying to put into words how the assault had destroyed my sense of safety, ended my marriage, triggered panic attacks and nightmares, made me afraid of closed doors and men standing too close. The words came slowly and painfully, but I kept writing because I needed the judge to understand that this wasn't just a legal case but a trauma that had changed everything about my life. I spent the rest of the week revising my victim impact statement until every word felt right. The hearing date arrived on a Tuesday morning, and I put on a navy dress that made me feel professional, and put together even though my hands wouldn't stop shaking. The courthouse was the same building where I'd gotten the protective orders months ago, but this time I walked through the metal detectors knowing Francis would be on the other side. His lawyer had worked out the plea deal, so there wouldn't be a trial or testimony, just the formality of him admitting guilt, and the judge accepting the sentence. I sat 3 rows back on the prosecution side, while Francis stood at the defendant's table in a gray suit I'd helped him pick out for a work conference 2 years ago. The prosecutor read the charges, and Francis's voice was flat when he said guilty to misdemeanor witness tampering. The judge asked if he understood he was giving up his right to a trial, and Francis nodded without looking anywhere near my direction. The judge accepted the plea and imposed the sentence: 2 years probation with mandatory counseling every week and a fine of $5,000. Francis's lawyer thanked the court and started gathering papers, while Francis finally turned and looked directly at me. His expression was blank in a way that felt worse than anger or sadness, like he was looking at a stranger instead of someone he'd been married to for 6 years. I looked away first and walked out of the courtroom before he finished signing the paperwork. Back at my apartment, I opened my laptop and found an email from Connor at HR with a subject line that said, "Important update." The email explained that Richard had been terminated effective immediately as part of his plea agreement, and the company was conducting an internal review of workplace safety policies and supervisor training requirements. They were also offering employees access to counseling services and creating a new anonymous reporting system for harassment concerns. I read the whole thing twice and felt nothing except tired. It was good that Richard was gone and that the company was finally taking action, but it felt like closing the barn door after the horse had already run off and trampled everything. If I did go back to work, at least I wouldn't have to worry about running into him in the hallway or the break room. But the thought of returning to that building at all made my chest tight. The mediator's office was in a bland professional building with beige carpet and motivational posters about communication and compromise. I sat on one side of a long conference table while Francis sat on the other with his lawyer, a woman in her 50s who looked perpetually annoyed. The mediator explained we were here to discuss temporary financial arrangements while the separation was pending, and she started with the easy stuff like who would pay which bills this month. Then we got to the joint savings account that had about $40,000 from both our incomes over the years. Francis's lawyer immediately jumped in and said her client should receive a larger share because of the emotional distress and reputational damage caused by the criminal charges. I felt my face get hot and my hands clenched under the table. The lawyer kept talking about how Francis had lost friends and professional opportunities because of the scandal, and how I should take some responsibility for the consequences of pursuing charges. I started to stand up because I couldn't listen to another word of this garbage. My own lawyer put a hand on my arm and asked for a 5-minute break. Out in the hallway, my employment lawyer, who had come as support, told me to take deep breaths and reminded me that Francis's lawyer was just doing her job by trying to get her client the best deal. But she also said she would shut this down immediately when we went back in, because it was absurd to suggest I owed Francis anything. We returned to the conference room and my lawyer addressed the mediator directly. She stated clearly that Francis's legal problems stemmed entirely from his own choices to warn a criminal suspect and to participate in creating conditions for an assault. She pointed out that Francis had never been charged as an accessory specifically because he cooperated, which was already a significant benefit to him. Then she said any suggestion that I bore responsibility for his consequences was not only wrong, but potentially actionable as harassment of a crime victim. Francis's lawyer backtracked quickly and said she was simply exploring all positions. The mediator moved us forward to actual negotiation. After another hour of back and forth, we reached a temporary agreement. I would get access to half the joint savings, about $20,000, and sole possession of the Honda we'd bought 3 years ago. Francis would keep his truck and the other half of savings. We'd split the credit card debt evenly, and each be responsible for our own legal fees going forward. Richard's plea hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning, 2 days after Francis's hearing. I barely slept the night before and kept checking my phone to see the time. Allegra met me in the courthouse lobby, and we rode the elevator up together without talking much. My sister couldn't fly out again, but she was on the phone in my jacket pocket with the volume low, and knowing she was there even just listening made me feel less alone. We sat in the front row of the gallery, and I watched Richard walk in with his lawyer. He'd lost weight, and his suit hung loose on his frame. The judge entered and everyone stood, then sat back down for the proceeding to start. Richard's lawyer stated that his client wished to plead guilty to felony assault, and the judge asked Richard directly if this was his choice. Richard said yes in a voice I could barely hear. The prosecutor read the terms of the plea agreement: 18 months in county jail with credit for time served, 3 years probation after release, mandatory counseling twice a month, and registration as a sex offender. The judge asked if Richard understood all the terms and consequences, including the registration requirement. Richard said yes again. Then the judge asked if I wanted to give a victim impact statement, and I said yes, even though my voice shook. I walked to the podium with my printed statement, and my hands were shaking so hard the papers rattled. I started reading about the fear that followed me everywhere after the assault, how I couldn't be in rooms with closed doors, how I jumped at footsteps behind me, how I had nightmares almost every night for months. I talked about losing my marriage because my husband enabled what happened, and then tried to minimize it. I described the panic attacks that came without warning, and left me gasping for air in parking lots and grocery stores. I explained how being assaulted by someone in a position of authority over me made me question every professional relationship and every interaction with men in my workplace. I said that Richard had violated my trust and my safety in a way that changed how I moved through the world. My voice cracked several times, but I kept reading until I reached the end. Richard stared down at the table the entire time and never looked up once. I couldn't tell if he was actually hearing anything I said, or just waiting for it to be over so he could leave. I folded my statement and walked back to my seat next to Allegra. The judge looked directly at Richard before imposing the sentence. She said his actions were predatory, and that he had violated a position of workplace authority that made the victim particularly vulnerable. She talked about how sexual assault causes lasting trauma that extends far beyond the physical act itself. Then she emphasized that the registration requirement reflected the seriousness of his crime and the need to protect potential future victims from someone who had demonstrated predatory behavior. She said the court took these cases extremely seriously and that Richard would be held accountable for the harm he caused. Hearing a judge say these things out loud in an official proceeding made something tight in my chest loosen just slightly. It wasn't enough and it wouldn't undo what happened, but it was validation that I hadn't been dramatic or oversensitive, that what Richard did was actually criminal and wrong. After the judge imposed the sentence, the bailiff led Richard out through a side door to begin his jail time immediately. Gabriel walked over and told me I did an excellent job with my statement, and that my testimony throughout the case had been clear and consistent. He said the case was now concluded from the criminal prosecution side, and he wished me well with everything going forward. We shook hands and he gathered his files and left through the main doors. I realized this man who I'd worked with intensely for months, who had prepared me for hearings and called to update me on developments, and made me feel like someone was fighting for me, was now just going to disappear from my life. The case was over, and he had other cases and other victims to help. Allegra and I met for coffee a few days later at a place near her office. She asked how I was doing now that both plea hearings were finished and the immediate crisis was over. I admitted I felt strangely empty and unmoored, like I didn't know what my life was supposed to look like anymore. For months I'd had court dates to prepare for, and legal meetings to attend, and statements to write, and all of that had given me something to focus on besides the trauma itself. Now there was just regular life, and I wasn't sure how to do that. Allegra said this was completely normal, and that a lot of survivors felt lost when the legal process ended. She reminded me that healing wasn't linear, and that I should be patient with myself as I figured out what came next. We talked for over an hour about everything and nothing, and when we said goodbye in the parking lot, I realized she was another person who would fade from my life now that her official role was done. I met with a legal aid lawyer the following week to file for legal separation from Frances. We sat in her small office and went through all the paperwork, checking boxes about assets and debts and custody which didn't apply to us. The lawyer explained that legal separation was a step before divorce that would protect me financially and legally while we figured out the permanent arrangement. I signed form after form, and each signature felt both liberating and devastating. I was ending a marriage I'd thought would last forever, walking away from someone I'd planned a whole life with. But I was also protecting myself from someone who had enabled my assault and then tried to minimize it, someone who had called his best friend to warn him instead of supporting me. The lawyer filed everything electronically and said Frances would be served within a few days. I walked out of her office and sat in my car for 20 minutes before I could drive home. I'll write the continuation following all requirements, focusing on action-driven content with minimal dialogue and reflection. The drive home felt like moving through fog, and I barely remembered taking the turns to my studio apartment. My phone buzzed before I even got my keys out. A voicemail from my lawyer saying Frances's attorney had already called to reject our proposed separation terms and demand formal mediation over the asset division. She said this could stretch out for months, maybe longer if Frances kept fighting every detail. I sat on my couch and stared at the wall, feeling so tired I wanted to cry. Being legally tied to Frances for months more, sitting across tables from him arguing about furniture and bank accounts, felt like torture I couldn't escape. But I called my lawyer back and told her to schedule whatever meetings were needed, because I wasn't backing down on protecting myself financially. 2 weeks later, I walked into my office building for the first time since the assault, and my hands shook so bad I could barely badge through security. HR had moved me to the 7th floor, far from where Richard's office had been on the 3rd floor. The new desk faced a window overlooking the parking lot instead of the interior hallway, which felt safer somehow. I kept my coat on for the first hour, even though the office was warm, like I needed the extra layer between me and everyone else. My supervisor stopped by to say welcome back and asked if I needed anything, and I just shook my head because my throat felt too tight to talk. I made it through 4 hours before the exhaustion hit. So hard I had to leave. Walking to my car, I felt this weird mix of shame for leaving early and pride for even showing up at all. The next morning, Millie appeared at my desk with 2 coffees and asked if I had a minute to talk. She said she was glad I came back and she was sorry she didn't do more to help after the assault. I told her that her statement to the police about seeing me right after it happened was incredibly important, that it helped prove I wasn't making anything up. She suggested we grab coffee in the break room, and we sat by the window where she told me she'd been harassed by a different supervisor 2 years ago. She went to HR and they basically told her to deal with it or find another job, so she just avoided him until he transferred to a different office. Hearing that she understood what it felt like to not be believed made me feel less alone. We talked for almost an hour about how messed up the whole system was, and when we went back to our desks, I felt like maybe I had an actual friend here, instead of just coworkers who pretended nothing happened. My therapy appointment with Adriana that week focused on the complicated feelings about Richard's sentencing being over. I told her I felt relieved the court stuff was done, but also angry that 18 months seemed too short for what he did to me. And I felt grief over everything I lost, my marriage and my sense of safety, and the life I thought I was building. Adriana said healing isn't a straight line, and I was allowed to have contradictory emotions about the outcome. She reminded me that justice from the legal system was just one piece, and I got to decide for myself what healing looked like. We worked on letting go of the idea that there was some perfect amount of punishment that would make me feel whole again, because that wasn't how trauma worked. I left her office feeling a little less like I was doing recovery wrong, just because I still felt angry sometimes. 3 weeks after Richard's sentencing, A woman from the state labor board called and said they were opening an investigation into my workplace based on the complaint my employment lawyer had filed. She scheduled a time to take my statement, and I met her at a coffee shop near my apartment because I didn't want to do it at the office. I spent 2 hours walking her through everything, from Richard's assault to HR's response that pressured me to just move on quietly. She took detailed notes and recorded our conversation with my permission, and she said the board would be interviewing other employees and reviewing company policies. It felt good to have the company's failures documented officially in some government file, even though I had no idea if anything would actually change. At least someone was asking the right questions about why Richard had been allowed to supervise people when HR already had complaints about him from before. That night, I opened my email and found a long message from Francis with the subject line, "Please read." I almost deleted it without looking, but something made me click it open. He wrote paragraphs trying to explain his behavior, saying he panicked when he realized Richard assaulted me and didn't know how to handle it. He said he made terrible choices because he was scared of losing his friend and his job and everything he'd built. He asked for another chance to prove he could be the husband I deserved, said he'd go to therapy and do whatever it took. I read the whole thing and all I felt was tired. His explanations focused on his own pain and fear, not on taking real responsibility for enabling my assault and then trying to cover it up. I hit delete and closed my laptop. I didn't owe him a response or closure or anything anymore. Millie stopped by my desk a few days later and said her friend who worked at a tech company across town mentioned they had an opening in their operations department. The job was similar work to what I did, but better pay, and a fresh environment where nobody knew my history. She offered to make an introduction if I was interested, and I said yes before I could overthink it. The interview happened the following week, and they offered me the position 2 days after that. I gave notice at my current job and felt like I was moving forward instead of just surviving. My last day was quiet, just packing up my desk and saying goodbye to Millie, who promised we'd stay in touch. Walking out of that building for the last time felt like shedding skin I'd outgrown. 3 months after Richard's sentencing, I was settling into my new job and living independently in my studio apartment. My sister flew in for a long weekend, and we cooked dinner together in my tiny kitchen, while I told her about my plans to eventually go back to the school for a project management certificate. She chopped vegetables while I stirred pasta sauce, and I realized I was actually making plans for a future that felt possible rather than scary. The legal separation from Francis was almost done, just waiting for final signatures. Richard was serving his sentence in county jail. I still had hard days where the trauma felt too big to carry, where I couldn't get out of bed or felt scared of my own shadow. But I also had good days where I felt strong and capable and proud of myself for surviving. I was building a life that was mine alone, surrounded by people who actually supported me. My sister and I ate dinner on my couch and watched old movies, and she told me she was proud of how far I'd come. For the first time since the assault, I could imagine being genuinely happy again. Not just okay, but actually happy. It wasn't about forgetting what happened or pretending everything was fine. It was about learning to live with what happened while still moving forward, still making plans, still believing I deserved good things. I was attending therapy every week with Adriana, and we were working through the hard stuff slowly. Some sessions I cried the whole time, and some sessions we talked about regular life stuff like my new job or weekend plans. The healing wasn't linear like Adriana kept reminding me, but I was healing. I could feel it in small ways, like being able to sleep through the night sometimes, or not flinching when a man walked past me in the grocery store. I was rebuilding trust in myself and in other people, figuring out who I was outside of being Francis's wife or Richard's victim. My sister left on Sunday afternoon, and I hugged her tight at the airport and promised to visit her soon. Driving home alone, I felt okay with the quiet instead of scared of it. My apartment waited for me with my books and my plants and my own space that nobody else had keys to. I had work tomorrow at a job where people respected me and therapy on Thursday, and coffee plans with Millie next weekend. I had a life that was mine, and I was going to keep building it one day at a time.